We lecture now on Rousseau's Dissent, a dissent from the central principles in so many ways of the French Enlightenment. So much is different about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his artisanal background, his self-education, his Genevan Protestant origins, his sense of himself as a solitary man in an age of sociability, a fervent deist, which he shares with the French Enlightenment, someone who believes in the existence of the God of nature known through nature, but who has rejected the Judeo-Christian tradition. Even there, Rousseau strikes a dissonant chord. He has a passionate deism and a deep aversion to the atheist's attempt to disprove or criticize proofs of God. His own arguments for the existence of God, he claims, to avoid the sorts of arguments such as those made by Philo, require not only reason but good faith and sincere feeling, and he distrusts the motives of the atheistic philosophers, a handful of whom he has met in the Parisian salons. He thinks they use their reason only for their own fame or glory, not sincerely to know the truth. Who could doubt God sincerely looking at nature and its designs? So reason, Rousseau argues, can be the enemy of truth and virtue. And indeed, he also will conclude what the new philosophers, the philosophes of the French Enlightenment in particular, call progress, can be the enemy of truth and virtue. Rousseau explodes onto the European intellectual scene with his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, published in 1749. He argues both from history and from rational analysis that progress in the arts and sciences has led us away from virtue, has lessened rather than increased virtue in the world. Rousseau first turns to historical evidence, arguing that what we learn from the study of the past is that moral decadence always accompanies cultural and intellectual progress. Since the Renaissance, our polite and cultivated society has lost its ancient virtues and strengths. Our social frenzy covers a profound depravity such as overtook Egypt and Greece and Rome after their own transitions from simpler societies to more cultivated and cultured ones. If one compares even contemporaneously, he argues, the simple Swiss and the American Indians to the cultivated Europeans, one finds that it is the former who compare favorably in terms of both virtue and happiness. No one will walk over you hurt in a forest in the land of the Iroquois, he argues. They will do it every day in Paris or London. And everyone understands, he writes, the moral superiority of Sparta in ancient Greece, where patriotism and love of country and devotion to duty flourished, compared to cultured Athens, which was lost in decadence and vice and egoism. For Rousseau, that historical evidence is consistent with a rational analysis that shows the linkage between cultural progress and moral decadence. The arts and sciences create and then satisfy artificial vices and human pride, serving luxury and vanity, not our natural needs. Our natural need is hunger. From hunger is food. And there is a great satisfaction to the hunt and a meal after the hunt, and much comradeship in the hunt. But in cultivated societies that have progressed in the arts and sciences, it is not food that people want. It's gold plate and a private chef and sauces that impress all the neighbors. The arts and sciences serve our vanity and pride. They create artificial needs that gnaw at us and separate us from our fellow creatures. There is a natural need for shelter. The arts and sciences creates distinctions based upon the magnificence of artificial houses. And one person living perfectly sheltered from the elements despairs that his neighbor lives in a larger or better house. The arts and sciences don't satisfy natural needs. They create artificial needs that then obsess and govern our life. They lead to laziness and to boredom and the vices attendant upon those. After the hunt and a meal, people were satisfied and relaxed. After the fine dinner in town, people are lazy and bored and prone to vice. What drama in Rousseau's themes? Given the Enlightenment and given the debates about human culture and nature that have occurred ever since in the West, think of the profound questions Rousseau is raising that will have a permanent place in Western debate. The celebration of the primitive over the cultivated. A view that culture is decadence. A distinction between the natural and the artificial. The history of how many countercultures and movements back to nature and movements away from the artificial, how many of those must be written in Rousseauist language since he wrote. To understand the development of these themes, which will lead to some of the most significant literature of the French 18th century, we first must understand Rousseau's natural religion, his deism, and his defense of providence. So let us encounter the Rousseau whom the philosophers first met at mid-century when he moved to Paris, Rousseau the fervent deist. Rousseau believes that there are obvious proofs of God. Newton has shown us that matter is inert. It is indifferent to motion or rest, and yet we see motion in the world that must have a source external to matter. We see the spontaneous motion of living things. We see the ordered and lawful motions of the world, and we infer, if we are sincere, if we follow an inner light based upon a good faith of the mind, that there is a will that is intelligent, wise, powerful, and good. That order cannot be the product of chance, and just as when we move our own arm, that will is what moves matter from an immaterial source. But if we know ourselves to live in a universe created by an intelligent, wise, powerful, and good God, why is it then that we suffer so in a world created by infinite goodness? How could there be evil? That is an essential question for Rousseau's deism, and he answers that we human beings are the cause of our own ills. That humanity is the king of nature because God has made us free, and it is better to be free than robotic, but we abuse the freedom that makes us supreme in the natural creation and do evil. Humans, not God, are the source of evil. It is what we have done, not what God has done, that has led to suffering. God offers an ongoing love and providence, mankind an ongoing wickedness. We do ill even though we know the good, because God has engraved it on our conscience. Conscience which is universal, as shown by the agreement of the codes of all the religions and nations. And what does conscience teach us? That we must seek the happiness of all, not our own happiness at the expense of others. That we must follow not the particular will that seeks our own well-being, but the general will that seeks our happiness through the happiness of that collective entity of which we are a part. That is how God made us as human beings, but we abuse it. Self-interest is insufficient to explain human behavior, heroism, sacrifice. But society has suppressed the natural man, and we must restore that being created by God to the greatest extent possible. Rousseau's second discourse on the origins of inequality, published in 1755, is a further justification of God's created nature against the human deformation of the world. In this work, Rousseau addresses the question of whether inequality, which he sees as the source of so much suffering, is natural or artificial, and he answers that it is not natural. Rousseau draws a lyric picture of a primitive pre-social humanity that informs us of what we have lost as a result of civilization. In the state of nature, where we lived largely as isolated individuals, we were vigorous, naturally healthy, morally sound. We were governed by self-love and compassion. If we saw a fellow sentient creature, we aided it. And we lived only according to natural instinct, without the torment of the passions or the fear of death. In a social sense, we were neither bad nor good because we were isolated and asocial. There was no ownership of anything, including no ownership of women by men. If one was hungry, one took a fish out of a stream. One took fruit off a tree. The idea of saying, this is my tree, is absurd. The moment you fell asleep, someone would take what he wanted. There was no property in a state of nature. Natural inequalities were all physical, but they were without serious consequences. A faster person, a stronger person could take larger or quicker animals. Someone else would take slower animals, or fish, or fruit, and nuts, and berries. We think that we need our modern society, Rousseau writes, but it is civilization that produces our ailments. There were many early deaths in nature. The deaths of children who were not healthy or strong, but those who lived were wonderfully fit. That's what happens in a primitive world. That's what happens in the animal world. The American Indians are healthier than the Europeans. Do you doubt that, he writes? Put the two of them, one European, one Indian, in a forest, and see who comes out after 2 months healthy and indeed alive. Human beings lived the natural life, but then there occurred in Rousseau's sense of things the great tragedy of human history. Out of some perceived ephemeral need to associate, to solve a problem, a temporary one, perhaps drought, perhaps flood, perhaps too many savage animals, people created a permanent society. And once that line is crossed, there never is any going back, because society is a dominant, coercively triumphant form of human life that sweeps away the morally superior primitive. Civilized societies will always draw into their orbit, conquer, overcome more primitive, though morally superior, forms of life. And what does society introduce that had not been there in nature? It introduces unnatural forms of relationship that create unnatural relationships. It creates property. This is mine. You may not take from this part of nature. It creates a division of labor and mutual dependence. It creates social inequality, the imposition first of the strong, then of the rich and clever. And to sustain that imposition, it creates arbitrary power that maintains social injustices that we come to think of as natural, but that are wholly a creation of culture. And both master and dependent in this artificial world are the victims of its unnatural needs and social insecurities. Both would be happier living as natural equals. Both would be happier without the vices and the obsessions of the social world. Both are the victims of insecurity and needs created only by an unnatural society. And the attempt to satisfy unnatural, artificial social needs has done something awful to human beings for Rousseau. It has stifled conscience. It has stifled natural compassion. It has made us separate from each other and wholly selfish and self-obsessed. And we now find ourselves, as Marx will repeat in the 19th century, separated from our real nature as a species. But for Rousseau, that means we find ourselves in society separated from our God-given nature as a species. In the wake of Rousseau's analysis of our ills, the question is, what do we do now? Because there is no going back to a pre-social state. For Rousseau, there are two means of partial reparation. First, education, and secondly, setting a new moral foundation to politics that will undo the worst of the social state. On education, Rousseau writes the books of Émile, his treatise on education. arguing that we must seek to create the greatest amount of natural learning for the child as an inoculation against social depravity. The goal is direct education by nature, not by men or by things or by books. Let children learn from their real experience of attempting to satisfy their real needs in the natural world. Education, Rousseau insists, begins in infancy. We swaddle our children tight to teach them restraint, thinking it makes them safe, thinking it prevents them from touching their bodies and exploring themselves. What it teaches is slavery. Let the child learn natural freedom and natural affections. He argues against swaddling clothes, and he argues changing the practices of French upper-class culture for breastfeeding, for mothers who raise their own children rather than giving them to wet nurses, so that the child from the beginning learns real affection, real relationships, natural relationships, not artificial and purchased relationships. Let the child learn not by rote, which means nothing, but by experience. Do you want to teach a child geography? When he's hungry, take him out and get lost in the forest and let him have to reason out from nature where the sun rises and sets, which way a brook flows, on which side of a tree the moss grows, the topography of the land. Let a child form strong bodies and senses, developing confidence in what God gave us to learn with. Develop the intellect by observation and always by promoting reasoning in the service of real needs. Similarly, let the student learn morals from natural consequences. If he breaks a window, disrespecting property, have him sleep with the insects. Have him sleep with the heat or the cold or the rain. The child will learn respect. Let the child experience mutually beneficial interactions that depend upon real ethical principles and relationships. Avoid religious education until adolescence. What can a child understand about ultimate things? The understanding always should relate to the real needs of life. And teach the student a useful, honest career. A useful, honest trade. Teach the student a useful, honest trade, not a career. Let the student learn to make something, a good that is traded in value because other people truly need it. In short, inoculate the student from the moment of birth against social depravity and send the most natural person possible into the world of men. Secondly, there is government. And in Rousseau's work, The Social Contract, he argues that a proper understanding of the nature and basis of government can make moral rather than depraved citizens out of us, even in the social state. In most variants of 18th century social contract theory, John Locke's, Cesare Beccaria's in Italy, the social contract is looked upon as a circumstance in which individuals trade the minimum necessary amount of their own individual liberty for security in the state. But in Rousseau's social contract, all individual freedom is given to the state. Unlike Hobbes's social contract, Rousseau's insists that one's happiness now in this social contract can only be one share of the happiness of the whole society. Think of it as a corporation. Each individual is an equal participant, shareholder in society. The only way the individual can profit, the only way the individual can be happy, is by working such that the whole collective entity prospers and is happy. And your share, your equal share of that collective happiness is the benefit you gain from society. And in such a model for Rousseau, politics itself now forces you to work for what? For the well-being of all. When one's self-interest can only be pursued by pursuing the well-being of all others, society becomes a means to overcome selfishness and alienation and to permit moral beings to exist in a civilized society. To achieve that, one must recognize that in politics, only the general will that seeks the interest of all has political authority. Even if a majority of citizens vote for something, if they are a majority seeking individual gain, that is illegitimate authority within the state. It has no claim. It does not embody the social contract and the general will. Only those who seek the interest of all have political legitimacy and can exercise sovereignty. This has certain profound democratic tendencies. The general will arises from all and applies to all, but there is no legitimacy to an immoral or depraved majority, but only to the general will. Only that general will seeking the interest of all is sovereign, not a majority per se. That makes us subject, when we are subject to the general will, to our moral selves, human beings who seek the well-being of all, which forces us, in Rousseau's celebrated phrase, forces us to be free, unenslaved to our own or to others' artificial power, even while in society. And to preserve that general will in the social contract, there must be no factions, no gulf between rich and poor, and no society too large for democratic self-governance. The Rousseauist legacy is always present and always active in the West from that moment on. The view that there is a conflict between nature and civilization, that we have suffered losses and discontents and made ourselves unhappy. The view that there is an original species nature which society must seek to restore. The view that freedom is being governed by the general, not the particular will, by virtue, not by self-interest. Thus, both the Jacobins of the French Revolution and communal counterculture can lay claims to Rousseau. Thus, as you will see, both Kant's specific categorical imperative and the totalitarian submergence of the individual into the corporate body, both can lay claims to Rousseau. He is with us still. Thank you very much.